If you feel slow or confused when reading sheet music, you're not alone. A lot of beginners struggle with this, and it can make reading music feel slow and frustrating. Hi, I'm Ruby Medina. I've been playing and studying piano for over 10 years, and there's a much easier way to understand what you're looking at. Most beginner songs actually come down to just 3 simple movements: steps, skips, and repeats. And once you see this, reading music starts to feel a lot more natural. Let's take a look. A step is when a note moves to the very next line or space. So right here is an example in the treble clef, and right here is an E, and the next note it moves up a step, and it's an F that we have as our second note. Now let's look at an example in the bass clef. Right here we have a C, and it moves up a step to D. Next, let's look at skips. A skip is when a note jumps over one line or space to land on the next. So right here, we have the treble clef, we have a C here, and then our next note is an E. So it's skipping over the D. Let's look at an example in the bass clef. This note right here is a D, and our next note is an F. So this is an example of a skip because we're skipping the space. Here we're going from one line to the next line. A repeat is when the same note is played again. So right here, let's look at an example in the treble clef. So here our first note is a G, and then our next note is G again. It's the same note. So right here is an example in the bass clef. So right here we have a C, and our next note is a C. So the note is getting repeated. So now let's look for steps, skips, and repeats in some sheet music. So in this first example, let's look at the treble clef line. So right here we have a D, and then our next note is a D. So see, we have a repeat right here. Our next note is a line. So it's moving stepwise. We have an E as our next note. So this, going from D to E, is an example of a step. Then right after E, we have another E. So that's an example of a repeat. And this last note in measure 2 is a D. So notice we're moving stepwise in a downward direction, going from E to D. And this first example we're looking at is Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. So now let's look at these 2 measures over here, and this is written in the bass clef. So right here we have a C, and notice that the next note is a C, so it's being repeated. Then the note after that is a B, so it's a step. We're moving from C down to B. Then the note after that, we have B again, so we have a repeat. Then in the next measure, we have an A, so we moved in a stepward direction from B down to A. Then the next note here is A, so we have a repeat. And then the last note in that measure, we have a G. So we moved from A to G. We stepped down. Now that you've seen this in sheet music, I'm curious, do you usually read notes one by one or try to see patterns? Let me know in the comments. Alright, now let's look at another example. And this is when the saints go marching in. This piece uses steps, skips, and repeats. So let's look for all 3. This piece is in the bass clef. And our first note right here is a C. And then our next note is an E. So we have a skip. Then the next note right here is an F. So that's a step, because we're moving from E to F. Then the next note, we have a G. So notice that moved in a stepwise direction. we have E, F, G. Now if we move to a different part of the song, if we look over here, we have a G, and then we have an E. So right here, we have a skip, because we're skipping the F, the line. We are moving from space to space. Over here we have another example of a skip. We have a C, and then the next note is an E. And if we move to a different section of this song, right here we have a C, and then notice that the next note we have a C again. So we are repeating the same note. Then over here, if we're moving from C to E, so we have a skip. And then notice right after the E, we have a G. So that's another example of a skip. And then after the G, we have another G, so then we have a repeat. So as you can see, most beginner songs really just come down to steps, skips, and repeats. Once you start noticing that, reading music becomes a lot easier. If you want a simple way to recognize notes on the grand staff, check out this video right here. Also, if you wanted to practice this with the same songs shown in this video, I've put them together in a songbook. Just comment songbook and I'll send it to you. See you in the next video.